How's it going? I'm Tony with Bay State Engines. Today we're talking about the Briggs and Stratton plastic-bodied lawnmower carburetor. This is on a lot of vertical shaft engines. Some of your Troy-Bilts, Craftsman's, Toros even are using these all over the place. They're a very common carburetor. There's two styles. There's a primer style carburetor, which we're not showing you today, and then there's an automatic choke style carburetor, which is the one that we're dealing with. Now this customer, just like many of my customers, has a no start situation, and it's due to contaminated fuel in the carburetor. The main jet might also be clogged, and we're going to check that when we're in there, but we're going to show you how to attack this carburetor the most efficient way possible. Now the tools and supplies we're going to need today to attack this carburetor are as follows. Over here we have a 7mm socket, and then we have an 8mm nut driver that we're going to be using to remove this airbox housing here. We also have a 7mm swivel socket that hopefully we don't need, but we very well could. We're also going to be using your favorite brand of carburetor cleaner, and of course some high pressure compressed air on a nozzle like this one. Highly recommend safety glasses for this. You're probably also going to need a ratchet, and there's a bowl drain on the carburetor that we're not going to touch, but we are going to show it to you. So first things first, if your lawnmower doesn't start, you definitely want to make sure there's good clean fuel in here, fresh fuel from not the Reagan era. Make sure that gas can has fuel from within the past year in it. Make sure the fuel is free of water, fill it up. If it still fails to start, your problem is most likely not the spark plug, but is almost certainly the bowl of the carburetor. So step one here, we have to remove this air cleaner cover, and it's just this plastic clip on top. So with my finger, there we are, we're already in to the air cleaner. Once we remove the air cleaner, we can see our 4 screws that we're going to be attacking here. We have an 8mm, another 8mm, and 2 7mm screws holding this air horn shroud onto the carburetor and onto a bracket that surrounds the carburetor. If you just want to drop the carburetor bowl, it's not necessary to remove this, but just so that you can see what bolts we're going to attack next, we are going to remove this for you. Okay, so now that we've removed both of our bolts, you'll notice that the threads on these two are far different from the threads on the inside ones. Definitely try not to mix them up when you go back together. If you have a hard time remembering, these ones are silver and these ones are black. Very simple, and they're also obviously different sizes. Now when I go to remove this, there's a breather tube in the back. It's a little finicky. I'm just going to use a screwdriver like this one, aka pocket pry bar, and I'm going to reach in back of here. You can't really see what I'm doing, but we're just going to pop that off, and that sits on this nipple. Make sure that you reinstall that before this goes back together, or dirty air will be able to get into the carburetor. Now we see the mission that we're after right here. This is the carburetor itself. This is the body of the carburetor. Over here on the side, we have a vent that sits in here. If you do choose to remove the carburetor, there's an O-ring in back. Make sure that the O-ring is in place, and make sure that this vent goes back in here. Also, you're going to have to fiddle with these linkages a little bit, but we're not even going to remove this entire carburetor. We're only going to remove the bowl. And to remove the bowl, we have a 7mm screw here and another 7mm screw here. On some of these lawnmower bodies, the body is tucked up real tight in back of here, and you really can't even get a socket and a ratchet on there. Luckily, this is not one of those models, so we're just going to use our socket and our ratchet, and we're going to sneak those 7mm screws off. Now, after I loosen them, just for the sake of brevity, I prefer to just grab them, and if I can, turn them by hand, and of course I can't because I'm on camera. So we removed both of our screws, and they look kind of like this. They have a flange on them, you'll notice, and they're definitely kind of a coarse thread because they screw into plastic. Now that we've gotten both of them off, there is an important thing to note. We're going to show you the orientation of this bowl on the carburetor. Now this is our bowl drain here. Believe it or not, that goes to the right. And you would think sometimes that it goes to the left because we're going to see our emulsion tube sticking down on this side of the carburetor. This provision in the bowl is to allow the emulsion tube to pick up fuel and not be jammed by this carburetor bowl. Unless you've removed all of the fuel from the tank, we're going to flip this machine on its side so it doesn't pour gas everywhere when we remove it. I'm just going to take my pry bar here and I'm going to stick it in between this, and I'm going to get this off of here, but we're going to flip the mower up before we do that. So now I'm about to attack this bowl. We've turned the lawnmower on its side because I know fuel would be flowing out otherwise, because this is always in constant pressure. When you flip it on its side, there's no fuel up here unless the tank is full. So our tank is not. So I have my little tool here. I know that I've removed both screws, and I have a rag underneath here to catch all the excess fuel that's going to spill out of the carburetor. So I'm going to go ahead and try and get this in here. So I've gotten it started, and I'm just going to pop it off the rest of the way. And now we're inside the carburetor's bowl. Now before we proceed, we're going to explain to you a little bit about this bowl here. This is going to be your bowl gasket. It's an O-ring. You want to make sure this O-ring isn't torn in any way, and you want to make sure it hasn't flattened out. Otherwise, it won't create a seal against the carburetor's body. Now on the very bottom here, you have a bowl drain. This is a 10mm Allen key to remove this. Unfortunately, because of how close it is to the deck of the lawnmower, you can't really get a normal size Allen key in there. So if you do want to use this bowl drain, you're probably going to have to take an Allen key and cut the short side just so you can get in here. Because of the way it's threaded, it's only a 1/4 turn fastener. It also has its own O-ring. You can see just the top part of it on the other side. Now, like I had addressed before, this is our provision for the main jet in the emulsion tube, which is next on the list to be removed. So this right here, this is our main jet inside of the emulsion tube. This is obviously our float. I hope you know what that is if you're going this deep into a carburetor, but if not, oh well. So we're going to take our pocket pry bar and I'm going to push it up against the edge of the carb, and then I'm just going to pop this out carefully. Bink. And this is our emulsion tube assembly. Now when you see I remove this here, this is going to be our main jet, and this is the emulsion tube up here. This is what atomizes the fuel as it enters the carburetor. Now there is a plastic slot inside of the Venturi in here. I don't think you're going to be able to see it. Yeah, probably not. Try. So there is a plastic little sleeve in there that is the Venturi. This piece of the emulsion tube actually sticks into that hole in the Venturi and the carburetor. So it's very important that you don't change the orientation of that tube when you have this emulsion tube out. Once this is in, you cannot change the orientation of the Venturi, so it's a non-issue. Now once again, we have a couple of O-rings here that we're going to check. Make sure that these aren't torn or swollen or anything like that. What the fuel does, it flows through this up through these. So you want to make sure all of these are cleaned out, and you especially want to make sure that this one's cleaned out. We're going to use our compressed air and carb cleaner to clean that. And if we have the opportunity, we're going to clean out the carb's body as well. We have the emulsion tube out. I'm going to use our solvent here, and with safety glasses on for sure, I'm definitely going to spray a little bit of carb cleaner in each one of these little holes. And even in this main jet assembly on the side here. And with it still wet, I'm going to take a little bit of compressed air, blast it in all of these holes, and make sure that everything's nice and clean in there and that we have a good flow. While we're in here, clean off the outside of the emulsion tube also. Now this is ready to reinstall, but before we do so, we're going to pull off the float and explain a couple of things on that end of the carburetor for you. All right, now this is our float assembly, and there's a couple ways to go about this, but just like the emulsion tube, it snaps into place. So we can actually take this float pin here, and while supporting it from the other side, we can really just pop this out. When we do so, we're going to expose our float needle. I'll be very careful. I just lost the float pin. That happens to me about 100 times a day. And we're looking at this Viton tip on the needle here. I wish I could show it to you under a loop, but under magnification, you want to make sure there's not a ridge on the slanted side of this material here. If there is, it's probably going to leak fuel and the carburetor will just flood. So this looks pretty good, but what we are going to do is we're going to clean this off, and we're also going to spray inside of where the needle valve sits, and we're going to just blast any crap out of there. Okay, so now I'm ready to reinstall my components after they've been cleaned off with solvent and compressed air. Don't spray this with solvent, by the way. If you do, you're going to ruin it, and just go buy a new one. This float pin, unfortunately, is able to move after you clip it into place. Be careful of that, because sometimes it obstructs the bowl when you're trying to reinstall it. So if you are fighting with your plastic bowl that was very easy to remove, maybe check your work first instead of ruining your carburetor. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to hold this very carefully, try and get my needle valve in its place. I know you have a hard time seeing me here. Can you see? Oh yeah, you can see that. That's pretty good. So I'm just going to clip that back into place, and I'll make sure that the float height is about level with this piece and level with the body of the carburetor, also relatively important. So that seems like it's staying in place, and now I'm ready to reinstall my emulsion tube assembly. So just like this, with the main jet facing out towards you, like we removed it, we're going to take this and we're going to push it carefully in here. Make sure that you're not forcing anything, and it seems like it's going in nice and easy. So I'm just going to take my finger and clip that right back into place. Make sure it's in as far as it came out. So now that we've gotten thus far, we only have the bowl left to reinstall. The inside of the bowl is right here. You can see, nice and clean. We got any goop out of there. Should there be any sort of particulate matter down in this region, it has to be cleaned out, because that's just going to go right back into the main jet. Like we've addressed in the beginning of this video, this side has to sit where the emulsion tube sits. This side goes towards the back of the lawnmower in this application. So I'm just like this. I'm going to line up these two screw holes. I'm just going to give that a little push. Get it right back on there. So now we have our screws that we use to hold the bowl on. We're going to put those back into place, and I'm going to start them by hand to make sure I'm not cross-threading them. Even though it's plastic, there really is no cross-threading. I get them both in here. And then, even though it's slow as molasses, I'm going to take my ratchet and I'm going to finish these screws off. This one you might need a swivel on. Luckily here we don't, and the carburetor is able to move anyway, so that's going straight back in there. Now we're ready to reinstall our air filter housing. So there's a couple of details you want to pay attention to here. First things first, these two pins have to go into these two provisions on the housing on the outside of the carburetor. You want to make sure that your gasket is in place. It's bright red. If it's missing, you won't see anything there. And then we have our ever important breather tube here. It's a lot easier with this shroud removed, but we didn't see a need to remove that shroud today. This is a little bit finicky here, so we're just going to try and sneak this into place. My finger in back of the breather tube. Just push that hose on. Can you even see it? You probably can't really see it, right? No. Oh, all right. So I got it on there. Pretty satisfied with that. Now I'm going to push this into place. And the tube stayed on. Lucky me. Now we're going to get our two outside screws started. The order of these screws isn't extremely important, but this is just the way I like to do it. Okay, so I've got my air filter housing bolted back up. All four screws are in place. The breather tube is where it belongs. However, looking at this air filter, we see that it has been soaked with trasholine down here. That's an industry term. Basically means bad gasoline. So because the air filter has been contaminated, we have a brandy new one. Look at that. Fresh from Santa's workshop. We're just going to throw that right on there. I'm going to put on this outside cover. If this is all filled with garbage, feel free to give it a nice wipe. Line this whole thing up, clip it back together. We're going to refill it with fresh fuel, and hopefully it runs. Thanks for watching.